Hey Lindsay, how's it going?
Hi, good, thanks. You?
Yes, very, very good, thank you. Cool. So today we're talking about ADHD,
hmm
attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or attention deficit disorder. What's happening there? Why do we have two
hmm
versions of this?
And well, it's I guess got the two domains when you think about the diagnostic process. So looking at both inattention as well as hyperactivity and impulsivity. So people could lean a bit more one way, the other way, or have a combined picture. So I guess it's the having some of those words in there, the hyperactivity word may not necessarily be the best descriptor for some people.
Yeah,
But
so
yeah, I think
it's
conjures up that kind of stereotyped image, don't we? Of I think for a long time, ADHD, the typical stereotype that come to mind is a very fidgety, wriggly, young boy in class that can't sit still. So I think
yeah.
it's yeah, the diagnostic understanding has come quite a long way since then.
So it kind of sounds like there's sort of three components there. So
hmm
inattention,
hmm
hyperactivity, and impulsivity.
Yeah.
And I suppose from a formulation perspective, like we're all individual and we could have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that, or just
hmm
this, or just this, or just this.
Mm.
What kind of drives that? What's sitting behind it? What causes it?
So yeah, so I guess they tend to group a lot the hyperactivity and the impulsivity together, but it's
Mm,
understood to have a very high heritability. So in terms of you inherit it through your genes. So if someone has an ADHD diagnosis, it is very, very likely that someone else in their family, if you track back, would also have
so it's your
met
parents'
a
fault.
threshold for diagnosis. Yes. Let's hope that's not the soundbite that lands.
Yeah. Well, no,
So,
it's
but
actually your
it's
grandparents' fault, but whatever,
yeah,
and
and
so on
then
and
it will
so
be
forth.
their
Yeah,
parents and their
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So, but I think that the awareness and understanding has shifted hugely in recent
Mm,
years.
mm.
So I think people are becoming a lot more aware, and I've certainly heard lots of stories of parents coming to me, and it's only been through going through a diagnostic process for their child that they've clocked, oh, hang on, and kind of then started to resonate with some of the questions and some of the thinking and the understanding, and then have also sought diagnoses for or at least to undergo an assessment process for themselves. So yeah,
Yeah.
very high heritability for
And I
ADHD.
think it's important to say that it's not just the heritability that can have somebody present with kind of ADHD type symptoms. It's
hmm
also there's measurable differences in our dopamine signaling
hmm
pathways within our brain. So, and that's kind of just you can literally measure it in the brain. You could scan people brain that have ADHD diagnosis and they will have a different signaling pathway. So
mm,
that where the brain actually struggles to generate that internal drive like needed for particularly low interest tasks, no matter how important they are. So instead the brain will rely on this kind of external trigger to get going, like having
mm.
urgency or interest or novelty or challenge, like this external thing is needed to kind of
Yeah.
get this thing going. Yeah.
So dopamine is one of our chemical messengers, and we almost might think of it as a bit, it's almost like a highlighter in the brain.
Mm,
It would highlight this is important. We need to attend to this,
yeah.
and it may be worth the effort to get it done. So it's thought that people with ADHD have lower levels of dopamine, and it's absolutely can be seen in the studies, but there's still that wouldn't be a sufficient way to diagnose someone. So if those dopamine
Mm,
differences showed up in a scan, that wouldn't meet the threshold for a diagnosis. So there is no one, I mean, we've talked about, inheriting it through our genes, but there is no one genetic marker or scan or test or blood test that could be done that would say would enable professionals to determine yes they have this diagnosis or no they don't. So it's quite a complex picture in how it is diagnosed, but the important thing is this is considered what it is, a developmental condition.
yeah.
So it's something that a person would have from birth. You don't I don't know, catch it later on in life. It's not something
No.
that develops later on in life. So certainly a diagnostic understanding would involve, tracking right back to, was this present in childhood and things like that. So there may be other, certainly some of the, if we're thinking about some of the ways in which ADHD can present, forgetfulness or things like that, someone with acquired brain injury or trauma may present with those things as well. But I guess it's how we get this full picture of meeting enough of the criteria that would be thought of as being ADHD criteria and from childhood.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm.
But I think the thing with that is crucial is really understanding that the brain kind of struggles to kind of generate this internal drive. And even if something's really important, there's the struggle to get going with something. And therefore, you need a kind of external motivator or something, whether it
Hmm.
be novelty or a deadline or anxiety to kind of activate the getting going thing.
Yeah.
Um, and that pattern can work short term, but if you live your entire life like that, it can lead to kind of some stress and some burnout for a lot of
Mm.
people. So people that have ADHD, certain people that I've worked with, it's really hard for them. And I think this is so important to understand is that it's not, I know that in social media terms, it looks like it's a super trendy issue to have. Oh,
Mm.
that's my ADHD, or like we said
Hmm.
last time, like that's my OCD.
Yeah.
But it is actually really, really hard. And let's talk a little bit about what the lived experience is for some of the people
Mm.
that like we've worked with. Mm,
Yeah, so some of the things you were talking about there, that would come under the umbrella of what we'd think of as executive functioning. So that's kind of our planning, organizing, prioritizing. And so someone may really struggle with, you talked sort of like getting started, so task initiation. So it may not be the way that a person organizes what they attend to and what they pay attention to based on, right, this is important, I'll get this done and I'll do that in this order. So it might be much more likely to be oriented around novelty, interest,
mm,
urgency. So it's the drivers are slightly different for what will suddenly kick in to attention. So I think the lived experience is that a person can often find themselves in a bit of a state of panic where you're about to be late for something or you've left it too late to meet this deadline, and then really having to work in a very intensive way to get
mm,
the thing done, whatever it may be. So that can have a real cost for energy and then kind of thinking about functioning thereafter, burnout and things like that.
mm,
And an extremely tiring way to live, just to maybe kind of feel like you're keeping up with what other
mm.
people seem to do effortlessly. I think that's the bit that I hear a lot of is how do other people do this? This is
Yeah,
just mysterious to me that other people seem to function and do these things, whereas I
yeah.
seem to roller coaster from one panic to the next. And people aren't talking necessarily about big, huge deadlines. It might just be getting child to school on time, and then you've started the day already, the whole house is in a state of chaos, or there's shouting, or there's dysregulation, or,
Yeah.
so thinking about how these can happen lots of times a day and the cost that that carries. So absolutely people can do these things, but it
Yeah.
comes at quite a high cost.
And I think certainly the part that I see a lot is the emotional kind of self-regulation challenges, that it's very, very up and down. And when you're talking about executive functioning
Hmm.
difficulties, but and task initiation, the switching,
Hmm. Hmm.
but I think at the end of the day, it's almost like if we were a computer and it just feels like I've had people say this over and over. It's like I don't have the same amount of RAM in my computer as
Hmm.
everybody else. And it's
Hmm.
like it's less RAM. And because of these signaling differences in dopamine, that is literally how people feel. It's like I've only got this much capacity. And when you
Hmm.
only have this much capacity, what we do with that capacity is actually quite important because otherwise if we take all of it and spend 16 hours on our phone that day, that's
Mhm.
out the window. And then
Yeah.
that causes the sort of spirals of shame and self-loathing and things that I see with people is they really, really beat themselves up. So I think one of the key pieces is to learn to be kind to yourself,
Mhm.
even if you
Yeah.
haven't managed to knuckle down and do something you really wanted to do that day. It's like for whatever reason you tried your best.
Yeah.
And maybe you just haven't quite found your way of working to get going. And that is a journey of curiosity and understanding
Mm.
yourself rather than a journey of like and fury
Mm.
and self-frustration and that kind of thing. So what do you kind of notice on this emotional regulation front?
I really have heard so many times what you're talking about, and it's a real double whammy, isn't it? In terms of people may have had a stressful experience of either really rushing to try and get the thing done, or not have it
Mm,
done in time, or so time blindness is something that's often talked about, kind of not having, thinking you might be able to do more than you actually can. But people would often say after the fact, it was obvious I was not going to be able to, but at the time I really thought I was. So there's the stress of whatever impact it's had on your life, but it's that self-talk. That if you're then
mm,
beating yourself up, if you're being hard on yourself, criticizing yourself, and it may come from other sources as well. It might be that the person's loved ones are also feeling the frustration of the things they find difficult, and that self-questioning around why is this so much harder for me than it
mm,
seems to be for other people? And I guess that just takes its toll further in terms of the impact it has on people. So when we're talking about regulation, there's something around how do we try and be gentle and
mm,
kind. So this is not completely letting ourselves off the hook and saying, oh, well, I have a label, therefore I don't need to attend to these things, or I don't need to try and find the strategies that work better for me. It's doing those things and trying to be kind to ourselves and trying to be gentle with there are some reasons why this might feel harder for me than for other people, and staying centered, staying grounded, and trying to then engage the strategies, because we know once that stress and that dysregulation kicks in, our thinking goes further offline. And that is it's draining, further draining the
and
resources that we have.
And what I've seen multiple times before, and I think we discussed as well that you've also seen this, is how often ADHD can get misdiagnosed
Mhm.
as anxiety or depression or whatever. And it you can end up with anxiety and depression in a way, but it's a
Of course.
type of anxiety and depression. It's frustration intolerance, like because those small obstacles that you're dealing with just feel enormous and
Mm.
your patience starts to go down under the cognitive load and now you're frustrated. And then there's that kind of when emotions arrive, they arrive really fast, and then there isn't an obvious trigger, and then sort of feeling kind of moody. And then there might be
Mhm.
emotional flooding that comes with that, and then an inability to recover from setbacks. And this whole cycle of emotional dysregulation can make people so anxious or make them so depressed that there's something so wrong with me. So then what
Mhm.
happens is they end up perhaps going to see their GP or something, go on the meds for that. And it sort of fixes it, but sort of doesn't. And I think when it sort of fixes it, sort of doesn't, it might be helpful to kind of like, actually pursue a diagnosis of ADHD because particularly in my sort of cohort of peers and in my age group, very much perimenopausal, the onset of ADHD in our sort of perimenopausal like years is incredible. And that's because obviously, as the estrogen declines, there's even less dopamine available. So we almost occur, I sometimes feel completely ADHD. Like, you know, what was I supposed to do today? I don't know. But that kind of sense, it kind of goes along with that kind of the
Mm.
anxiety and the depression and the stuff that goes alongside that. So let's talk a little bit about, just what it feels like. what have you heard people say it sort of
Hmm.
feels like to have this sense?
And I guess before that, I think it's so interesting how people are really trying hard to make sense of what's going on. And I think that there are a whole cohort, particularly of women that are now reaching sort of their middle age, that perhaps haven't explored a diagnosis. I think it was probably thought about quite differently when they were children. Who may be ADHD. And it's often so in perimenopause, it's not that you get ADHD in perimenopause, but it's often the strategies that you've used or the ways you've masked suddenly don't work for you so well because you have all of these additional challenges.
Yeah,
So it almost reveals what was there already, and you've kind of been holding it together,
yeah,
but now with this additional load on top, it's just not functioning in the same way. And I think what you talked about with anxiety and depression, absolutely they can co-occur, but a
mm,
lot of the things that a person may look at and say, well, I think this is anxiety, could be ADHD alone, or vice versa. Same with depression. If someone really struggles to initiate tasks and just spends hours and hours doom scrolling and feels really stuck and really isn't enjoying what they're doing and really struggles to motivate and do things, that could absolutely look on the surface like depression, but it might actually be about something else. So I think there's something really helpful in pursuing a diagnosis to really understand. And of course, trauma, a lot of,
yeah,
forgetfulness, distractibility, impulsive reactions, task avoidance, that could absolutely be understood or explained through a trauma lens. So it's really helpful, I think, if a person is wondering, could this be part of my experience? To have an assessment and just to look into it further, because I think that people where that they've been later diagnosed have had almost a relief because they're like, oh, for years I was on antidepressant and it wasn't depression, it was something else entirely. So a sense making and a relief, but also kind of a grieving process around I have spent decades struggling with something that I didn't know was a thing, and I could have been doing things differently to help myself, or I could have, yeah, just maybe seen myself in a different way. So
yeah,
where a lot of people I've heard maybe grow up with being told they're too much. So if the impulsivity, the interrupting, the kind of high, fast pace, people might have been grown up being told they're too much, or if it's more the other way, being told that they're lazy because they're not managing to get things done. Those are the scripts that kind of become
yeah,
part of a person's internal working model. And I think if you think that those are maybe personality or something that you're choosing to do, that lands in a very different way than if you maybe want to understand this is maybe your hardware, and it's how do you work with it in a different way. Yeah, and I
yeah.
think that's a very different way of interpreting how a person engages in the world, rather than just kind of running those scripts that maybe they've been told growing up.
And I think let's switch to what kind of treatment or things that people can do because of most of my clients that have ADHD, they definitely have experience of like they go on the meds. And
Mhm.
I'd say about 80% of my clients with ADHD, the meds work fantastically in the beginning. And they're like, oh my gosh, you take this pill and it's awesome.
Mhm.
But almost all of them, after a few years, find it isn't the silver bullet I was hoping for. And they kind of still might struggle with some capacity management or getting knuckled down, that kind of thing. And I think emerging research that I was looking into was starting to link ADHD with kind of sensory processing
Mhm.
disorder, and this disorder was kind of quite interesting in looking at how it informs what type of ADHD you've got. So for example, if you're sensory craving and seeking and needing stimulation and all that kind of stuff, you might have more impulsivity and hyperactivity in ADHD. Whereas if you're sensory avoidant, you actually might be somebody that you really just get inattentive and you cannot have too much stimulation or noise. So that data is actually quite interesting because if you
Mm.
know your sensory type and what you like, it might give some clues as to some of the things you could try to do to set up in your environment or in your world or in your life to
Mm.
help yourself kind of, with the executive functioning or with the emotional dysregulation piece. Let's
Mm.
say a little bit more about this.
And do you know, I think it almost goes with any all of the things we've been talking about, that process of really starting to know your lived experience of a particular way of being or difficulty or presentation is so helpful in then thinking about how you can be compassionate to yourself and think about where might I be able to hold things in a slightly different way, perhaps. And to talk to your idea around the medication, I also think that with so many medications, it can be very supportive and really scaffold things to feel a bit different. But we would also be encouraging to think about what changes can be done alongside that to
Yeah.
create other shifts that can have long-term lasting benefits. So what we're looking at, I guess, is that there is no cure because this is just hardware. This is just a
Mm.
neurodevelopmental, this is the way someone's built. So it's just thinking about how the medication maybe changes some of the chemical processes that happen. But equally, thinking about how some of the strategies and how you might know what works for you and what doesn't is a really helpful way to think about how you might set yourself up for better outcomes. So, your sensory example that you gave there, if a person was, let's say it's in a work context, so it's an adult in a work context, and they've got to knuckle down and do something that they maybe would find hard to initiate because maybe it's not a task they find particularly rewarding or enjoyable. It might be a bit monotonous. So, thinking about if you were sensory avoidant, going into and needing quiet to be able to be focused, and that's your best chance for kind of engaging with the task. Going into a loud, noisy, open plan office is
Oh,
not going to be particularly
disaster.
helpful for you. Although
Mm.
you can, but then it's maybe about, do you have headphones? Do you
Headphones
have,
and
things? But equally, someone who's more sensory seeking, and actually the calmness comes from there being enough stimulation around. Spending lots of time at home in the quiet, working from home, may not be very helpful for in that scenario. So I guess it's thinking about knowing how to set yourself up with the best environments that generally works for you. And then there are lots of strategies, and I think this is where social media has been quite good. Lots of very short clips around strategies that might help. And I think that what those can be useful for is a person can try something out.
yeah,
If setting a
give it a
timer or
whirl.
breaking a task down to something really small just helps you to get going, try a strategy. If it helps you, roll with it. If it doesn't, then we
Yeah.
can set it aside and try
And
something else.
I think certainly with some of these strategies and the emerging research that's coming out, if you are a very craving seeking person, one of the principles behind that is that a tired body equals a quiet mind.
Mhm.
So, from an occupational health perspective, like the occupational therapist will say, all right, your hyperactive, impulsive kid, get a trampoline in the garden, wake up in the morning, go. 10 minutes,
Yeah.
go and bounce like
Mhm.
you're like, go, go, go. And all that kind of activity, or run up and down a hill, or go and
Mhm.
do something very vigorous. It actually, what it does is it kind of like calms the mind, focuses the mind a
Mhm.
little bit better. So, but that doesn't necessarily work for the avoidant person. So again, this
Mm.
is where you kind of need to almost be your own guinea pig and do some experiments and work out, well,
Mhm.
what works for me? And that is, it's
Mm.
true what you say. You go on social media, like what are some of the techniques that are out there, and try some things, because
Yeah.
what works for Bill will not work for Sarah.
Yeah.
And it's kind of leaning into what might work for you.
And most of the things that I've heard people say that they've come across or, seen online, that they're not things that are going to have downside. The worst that would happen is it wasn't particularly helpful for me. These are kind of like different ways of creating novelty or using competition as a way to make a boring task more interesting, because that can help activate the sort of the task initiation and the dopamine
Yeah.
system associated with it. Creating mini deadlines. So as you know, I work at a university, and certainly there's much more awareness, I think, now in teaching environments of how to better support people with who have neurodiverse ways of needing to engage with material. And so mini milestones, smaller deadlines, almost creating the urgency. So, if I'm supervising research, there is an expectation to get this to me. I'll be expecting your email at this point. And that create helps keep someone on track because that's enough of a deadline that it will then keep them away from the actual for real deadline that maybe is further down the line. So
Yeah.
there are lots of strategies that can help. And these are strategies that you don't have to be an ADHDer to find these things useful. Breaking down tasks into smaller chunks and having mini deadlines, those can be universally helpful. So I think that you don't need to think, well, I don't know, I haven't sought a diagnosis. If you think you may meet criteria, these could be strategies you could start to test and employ anyway.
Yeah.
Another one that I've heard a lot of people talk about is body doubling,
Mm.
which was a term I hadn't heard about until I think it's certainly become much more consciously in sort of the public awareness now. And that would be where almost is someone doing a task alongside you. So in a work scenario, that might be just going and sitting with someone. They may be doing their own task. They're not sat next to you, but you're just doing it in a room with another person. And what people have said is it almost stops the distractibility. So they
Mm.
won't kind of distract themselves and kind of get on their phone or be going off and doing something else because actually it's almost an accountability partner. So the person just being there provides enough of a wrap around sort of scaffold to help
Yeah.
stay focused on the task. So that can be another thing that people have said that they can find really helpful.
I think the other thing that's crucial is to kind of just really get that it's capacity management as well.
Hmm.
Because there is a tendency to sort of overcommit or overpromise or underestimate effort or hyperfocus until crashing and repeating
Mm,
cycles. And, so when you look at energy management, as much as attention management, looking at how much stimulation can you tolerate? Do you need
mm,
lots of stimulation or do you need void of stimulation? And if my RAM of my computer is this much, how am I looking after that? Am I getting enough exercise? Am I sleeping well? How's my
yeah.
environment designed so that I'm actually like the environment supports me and works for me? Have I got sensory regulation support? Do I have behavioral strategies or some coaching or something that I'm following? It's like these are my strategies that work for me and getting me going, like body doubling or headphones or, you
Mm,
know, um, and looking at that self-compassion piece as well, like being kind. It's like, okay, I'm just learning to understand myself. And sure, medication if appropriate, but understanding that that's not necessarily the silver bullet that it is for some people. It might work for you and then might not.
mhm.
It's so variant for various
Yeah,
people.
sure.
Yeah. So anything else we have as ideas before we wrap up?
I think that was a really nice summary. And as you were talking, I was just thinking how environments, being in a calm environment, people often report being really helpful. But this, ironically, that maintaining a clutter-free, calm, organized environment is one of the things that people can really struggle with. So I guess just thinking about the energy, what gives energy and what steals energy, and how to find ways to try and create systems that work for
Yeah.
you. And those will take energy to implement and maintain. But yeah, I think just learning the what fills the bucket and what empties it is really
And I
helpful.
think, I suppose the final thing that I just want to kind of end the podcast on is to just say that it's not about trying to cure ADHD because, as you said, it's a developmental sort of challenge. It's like the goal is actually building a life and a
Mhm.
systems and that kind of thing that work with your nervous system and work with the way that you work. So it's really about understanding yourself at a deep level,
Mm.
loving who that is, and with all its foibles, and kind of
And there's
working
lots
with
to
it.
love. It's not just the challenge, is it? There's lots of really great qualities that come alongside
Yeah,
as well, and how we can embrace, I guess, the full picture.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. All right, so on that note, we'll end there until we continue musing things, health, relationships, and trauma. Till then, take care. The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counseling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.